And I'm here to introduce the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is an independent nonprofit organization which maintains a wonderful research library with 14 million manuscript pieces and counting. And we also put on some wonderful public programs as well as academic programs as well. We make our collections free and available to the public. We are only able to host these programs because of the sponsorship or support of our members, and we hope that you will take a look at our upcoming programs on our calendar, masshist.org/calendar, see what's coming up, and also see how you might support the work of the MHS. But let's get to the program today. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Barbara Gannon is Associate Professor of History at the University of Central Florida, where she teaches courses on oral history, war and society, and U.S. military history to 1900. She is the author of The One Cause, that's W-O-N, The One Cause, Black and White Comradeship in the Grand Army of the Republic, which won the Wiley Silber Prize for the best first book in Civil War history in 2012. She's also the author of Americans Remember Their Civil War. She's here today to discuss a project that she has been working on with her students on Civil War memory and commemoration. And she will be in conversation with Professor Nina Silber, who is the John Westling Professor of History and Department Chair at Boston University. She is the author of numerous books, including The Romance of Reunion, Northerners and South and the South, 1865 to 1900, Daughters of the Union, Northern Women Fight the Civil War, and most recently, The War Ain't Over, Fighting the Civil War in New Deal America. Professor Silber has worked on numerous public history projects ranging from museum exhibitions at the Gettysburg National Military Park to film projects on the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. So, welcome to Professor Gannon and Professor Silber.
Well, I'm going to first give a paper, and then we're going to have a little chat about some of the things I'm going to talk about. First, I want to thank everyone for being here, and for all of those in the Zoom world. I'd like to thank Kenneth Rich Anale for inviting me, and Gavin Clispies, and Olivia Saya, and Nina, of course, for having me and for welcoming me. When modern Americans think of Black soldiers' heroism in the Civil War, they often think of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. They also think about Fort Wagner, in which they quite literally gained glory in a movie of that same name. A monument stands in front of the Massachusetts State House, not far from here, that honors that regiment. But how many of them, people who have watched the movie, or anyone else, remember their heroism at the Battle of Olustee in Florida, the largest battle to occur in that state, a battle that constitutes one of the deadliest for Union forces based on the number of participants? Before I became a Floridian, I only knew the name. Later, I knew in my role as Civil War memory guy, I found out that the Olustee, Florida Battlefield State Park was a lost cause landscape. I knew that there had been efforts to place a Union memorial at the site that failed. Later, I heard that some of the bodies still might be there. But in my naivety, I assumed it couldn't have been many bodies. People knew about it, couldn't find them. I really found it difficult to believe or understand that in Thank You for Your Service, 21st Century America, where we commemorated Memorial Day, originally the day for the Union dead, now with picnics and baseball games, maybe that was a hint, that there could be unmarked graves of U.S. soldiers and no one would do anything about it. I was wrong. The remains of the Union Olustee dead remain close to where they died today. Black and white Connecticut men and New Yorkers, free men and the formerly enslaved, and likely some men of the 54th. Together, they represent the interracial coalition that freed the enslaved and preserved the Union. Their skeletal remains lie in body bags in a mass grave found after the war, after their remains had been dug out of shallow graves by feral animals. They lay there unknown and unhonored because of the cause for which they gave that last full measure in a war for freedom, a sacrifice on the altar of reunion and reconciliation. Dead soldiers, though, of the Civil War have been the subject of several scholarly studies because of the centrality of honoring the war dead to the Civil War's legacy and memory. From a scholarly perspective, the story expands in the body of work by demonstrating an almost staggering act of dishonoring the Union dead, a Civil War erasure that continues to this day. John Neff, my late dear friend, argued in Honoring the Civil War, Commemoration and the Problem of Reconciliation that there was, quote, no more significant nor more eloquent than in the commemoration of the war soldier dead for the national government and all American citizens following the war. The commemoration of the war's dead provided the quintessential form for engaging death and, most important, expressing the war's meaning. Quite rightly, he was skeptical of the national myth that emerged from these commemorative activities. However, Olustee demonstrates that dishonoring the dead serves a competing myth, in this case, the lost cause. Confederate Civil War memory, particularly when central to dishonoring the dead is race. In this case, lost cause advocates create a racialized landscape of memory in Florida, the centerpiece of which is dishonoring Black and white soldiers who fought for emancipation. Today, I will describe exactly how this happened and the direct connection between the failure to commemorate Civil War memory, the Olustee dead, and the battlefield's racialized public landscape. I will start with the battle mostly because most people don't know anything about it, though this audience may be one of the few I have spoken to that know about this engagement. Next, I will talk about the fate of the dead, in this case, their bodies and their bones. The erasure. I will then discuss the racialized lost cause landscape at Olustee, one that has been preserved until this very day. One of the usual suspects of Civil War memory, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, played a key role. They are not solely responsible, of course. There's plenty of blame to go around. It is also about the abject failure of officials to address the fate of well over 100 U.S. soldiers that can only be attributed the triumph of reunionism and reconciliation in Civil War memory. Now, this is not just my effort. I've had interns and graduate and undergraduate classes who've worked on this project. Recently, we've created a story map that captures their effort. I had my MA student, Steve Tresslad, did a master's thesis on it. When I asked him to find out what the story might have been there, the story, though, doesn't begin now. It begins 158 years ago. It's a little-known battle outside of the traditional Civil War narrative. It focuses, when we talk about the Civil War, everyone talks about the main Eastern Theater. Occasionally, we have a trip to the Western Theater to visit Shiloh or Vicksburg. Usually, most of the Civil War to people is the Peninsula Campaign. First Bull Run to the Peninsula Campaign, to Second Bull Run, to Antietam, to Chancellorsville, to Gettysburg. We get lost in the wilderness, and people surrender, pretty much. This is the lesser-known Department of the South. If it's known at all, it's really known for the 54th Massachusetts and the film Glory. And well, that's it. No more movies about the Department of the South or more than the 100 Black regiments in the Union Army or their battles. The 54th was at Olustee, but so was the 35th U.S. Colored Troops, formerly the 1st North Carolina Colored, and the 8th U.S. Colored Troops, as well as the all-white 7th New Hampshire, the 7th Connecticut, who were kind of jokingly known by their comrades as the 77th New England, the 47th, 48th, 115th New York, as well as a variety of mounted and other artillery units. While the battle included Black and white units, African American emancipation plays a prominent role in the reason for it. The Union had occupied Jacksonville, and the commander wanted more soldiers in his units and moved in 50 miles west into the countryside. He was going to recruit Black soldiers. He was also going to cut off all the agriculture from Florida to the Confederacy. Florida, oddly, was a cattle state. Think of it as the Texas of the South. Now, also, Abraham Lincoln was pursuing his 10% strategy. He'd come up with that idea, which the radical Republicans sort of put to death, of getting 10% of the voter aged white males to pledge allegiance to the U.S. and bringing the state back into the Union. That didn't work, but it was still on people's mind in February of 1864. Now, in addition, this is a strategically important battle, even though Florida tends not to be. This is an extraordinarily bloody battle. Based on the number engaged and its casualties, it is one of the bloodiest fought by Union soldiers. Now, in February 1864, Union soldiers, black and white, moved out from Jacksonville into the Florida countryside. The commander, Truman Seymour, hoped to surprise the Confederates before they would be in position to stop his advance. The Confederate commander, Joseph Finnegan, had heard about this raid and moved to intercept Union forces. He arrived in an area, now Baker County, Florida, near Ocean Pond, and near a small town railroad crossing called Olustee. He arrived before Union forces and managed to put up hasty breastworks, nothing very elaborate, to stop them at this location. Both sides had about the same number, 5,000. Among the most successful and experienced units were the 54th Massachusetts. Other white units had experienced, but many of them had been furloughed because they had re-enlisted. So the units, particularly the 7th New Hampshire and Connecticut, were less experienced. Overall, it was one any military historian would expect from a Civil War battle. Two sides approximately the same size. One has a chance to dig in some way, and the units, one set of units is more experienced than the other. Generally, the less experienced unit that has a meeting engagement or sees it that way, and the other units are entrenched, will lose. Now, the Confederates won after a very hard-fought battle. The 8th USCT was particularly hard hit because it was a new unit and inexperienced. It had trained, it had been at Camp Penn, but the commander had not allowed the commander of the 8th to take his men out to actually shoot their rifles. So they had limited experience. The 7th New Hampshire had been given old and defective rifles. They had taken away their modern rifles and given them poor rifles, and they failed. The 54th Massachusetts is critical because it arrived later in the battle, and it executed a very difficult military task, executing a controlled retreat to protect other units. Very much more difficult than charging a fort under bombardment. If we need another movie, I think it's Olustee. After the battle ended, Confederates and Union soldiers documented the murder of black soldiers, though some black soldiers were allowed to surrender. Confederates sent these men to Andersonville. Many of them died there, alongside the men from New Hampshire, New York, and Connecticut. Regardless of how they died, though, the Union soldiers slain in the battlefield were not removed by U.S. forces because the Confederacy controlled the battlefield. The remains that could be found by Confederates were placed in a shallow grave or in a mass grave. Ironically, their bodies rest near federal land, near state land, near Confederate memorials that fly flags honoring the missing in action of American wars. 2 years after the war ended, in 1866, Lieutenant Frederick E. Grossman, 7th U.S. Infantry, a German immigrant who had enlisted in the pre-war army, went to Olustee to find the bodies. He brought wagons, he brought bags. His burial party went hunting for all the remains of bodies. By his own report, he explained what had happened to the Union dead. They were buried by the Confederates in such a careless manner that the remains were disinterred by the hogs within a few weeks after the battle, in consequence of which bones and skulls were scattered broadcast all over the battlefield. Grossman and his men counted about 125 human skulls among the remains. He was convinced that they were all Union dead because the Confederate dead were principally buried on the south side of the railroad, and they were more carefully interred. Their graves are even now in perfect condition. He buried these men in a mass grave surrounded by a 27-foot long and 18-foot wide fence. So so later on, it was about 1873, an Olustee veteran named Loomis Langdon, he had been in an artillery unit, went by, and someone pointed out to this broken fence and said there had been a memorial there to Union soldiers. And Loomis Langdon looked at that and said, well, where is the memorial? And that memorial had been placed by by Grossman to mark the mass grave he had created, but it no longer existed. So Loomis Langdon was worried about the men who had been buried in that place. So he wrote to the War Department, and the War Department wrote him back and said it was taken care of. There's a nice cemetery there. They called it the Olustee Soldier Cemetery, and we are not going to do anything about that. We believe that that mass grave is still there, and we believe that because we have found evidence that it wasn't moved. We also have what became of that area, which will support the idea that the mass grave of black and white soldiers is still there. Now, the statue that Grossman had erected had been wooden, and he completely described it, and it had, for example, peace and unity on it. He gave the exact wording. And that memorial exists today because in 1991, reenactors replaced it. It had been missing. It had been what, even though he made no mention of the dead, the original statue was to mark the place where they had placed all the Union dead. Years later, archaeologists will examine that, and I'm going to talk about what they found. And that will, I think, make it even more clear. Now, the park is not without monuments. The area that is Olustee battlefield, everyone was aware of the battlefield, and the UDC bought the land for $1, 3 acres. And when they did that, they placed memorials. And we have a story map with these memorials on them. And they are only to the Confederate dead. And that wasn't a mistake. Later, when they could not control the battlefield anymore, when they couldn't keep it up, it became a Florida state park. But you have to understand one of the critical elements to it being a Florida state park. It is surrounded by national forest land. And the state park exists basically as one piece of the Osceola National Forest. Now, the UDC had used their political power to get the state of Florida to pay for the memorials. And actually, one legislator named Frank Clark, and we found this documented in newspapers, had said we needed to add the Union dead to the monuments. The UDC ran someone against him. He was running for Congress. He lost. And they made it clear it had to do with the fact that he had some notion of honoring the Union. When they asked the UDC why they did that, they were very specific. If the Union dead had been white men, it is possible that we would have remembered them in the bill as they were Negroes, and we ignored them in the bill. We consider the change by the legislature as worthy of our highest indignation. And that was his change, which added the word Union. So that was struck down, and he was struck down electorally. In another article, they explained exactly what was going on. They did not want the Confederate dead to be honored with the Union dead, quote, because the soldiers of the Union Army buried there were Negroes. So they seem to understand that there are Negroes buried in the area. Everyone seems to understand that. There's no Confederates on the field where the Confederate monuments are. What Olustee has is an interracial burial ground within what is now allowed to be an African American cemetery. And I'll explain what we know about that. So the state allocates the funds in 1912. They finally build the memorials. They don't mention Union because that was removed from the legislation. The UDC put up 2 more monuments to Confederates. The first was to General Alfred Holt Colquitt, the, quote, hero of Olustee, claiming he prevented a Sherman-like invasion. The second was to Brigadier General Joseph Finnegan, the overall commander of the Confederates. The UDC used their power to erase the Union from the landscape. And this was quite easy in a time when you had the 30s, you had World War II fought with a segregated military. And even that passes, and you have the civil rights movement. The state of Florida takes over the battlefield as part of its state park system. The Osceola National Forest is created around it. The federal government's heavily involved as a civilian conservation corps there. So it's not like it's pristine private land. So that continues until no one is aware of the bodies. But one of the great giveaways that people might be is that that area was allocated to be an African American cemetery, as it is still today. So what you have is the 1991 memorial. You have an African American cemetery where they're still burying locals. You have a fence, and you have the state park with the Confederate memorials. And in everyone's mind, everyone's belief, the bodies are still in the African American cemetery. Now, one way we know this was there was actually an archaeology report in 1994. They chose a specific area where they thought the graves might be. That's how well known it is. And what they did was they just did a test. They didn't do they didn't do what you would do normally, but they did test the soil. And they found that unlike the rest of the area, the soil is disturbed. There is what they call organic hardpan, which was generally present throughout the surrounding area, is either absent or deeper than the 3 feet below the surface at this site. And they concluded, in this case, lack of hardpan within the test area may indicate the most likely location of our missing soldiers. Human activities such as digging a mass grave would disturb it. Now, this Olustee, people were aware of it in 2014 at the 150th anniversary. There was another effort to put up a Union memorial, but if you read the newspapers, if you read the discussion, no one talks about the fact the bodies are there. If you go there, everyone knows it. Every local, the people you talk to, know about the mass grave. Now, a lot of the focus of this has been what the state of Florida does or doesn't do. I think this is a federal government responsibility. I also had students research the law, and I knew something about it myself. Congressional intent and federal policy on the treatment of deceased veterans and our soldier dead is clear. The federal government has an obligation to these men. The Civil War has long been viewed as the impetus for the creation of the national cemeteries we know today. The earliest reference to national cemeteries were in 1861, where the War Department promulgated a command that made the Army quartermaster find the Union dead and bring them. And later this sort of evolved into the national cemetery system. In 1867, there was a National Cemetery Act. This appropriated money for the upkeep of the cemeteries. But it also specified what will be ubiquitous, the headstones are very much the headstones of soldiers. In 1873, they allowed all honorably discharged veterans to be laid to rest at national cemeteries. And there's a long series, even in the 1920s, to giving Confederates their own headstones. So we still have the National Cemetery Administration, which is responsible for this. So more recently, the Dignified Burial and Other Veterans Benefits Improvement Act in 2012 ensures the dignified burial for deceased veterans with no known next of kin, and that they have to furnish caskets and provide the identification and burial of unclaimed or abandoned human remains This seems directly applicable to the situation in Olustee. In the 155 years since the national cemetery system was created, everyone has been included in this, including Confederates, Allied foreign nationals, and everyone else. Why not these men? The national cemetery system was directly created to deal with their remains. There's no sunshine clause specified by Congress regarding the burials of Civil War soldiers. Now, from when Langdon informed them of the fact the bodies were there and unmarked, they should have acted. It was contrary to war policy and to congressional law. It's a dereliction of duty by the Confederacy, because you do have some obligation to treat the war dead reasonably. But mainly, I think it is a failure of the current government of the United States' statutory obligations to veterans. And that's how I want to frame this. Someone once asked me, was I going to waste money? No, I pay money. It's called taxes. Now, when one stands next to the statue and looks around, the statue is there from the reenactors. And you look around the semicircle, and there's all of these graves and there's one empty area. I have to say, you feel terrible. You're always drawing your eyes to the empty area. There are no gravestones, and there is a fence separating these men from the official battlefield. People made sure of that. But this area is right near federal land. It's governed by the United States government. It represents a ghostly memory of a war for union and freedom, fought by white men and black men, some free from birth, others free by their own sacrifice. All U.S. soldiers who deserve much better.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Barb. That's, it's a very powerful story. And I guess I wanted to start by commending you for taking this on and for doing this project, because, it has so many important angles about the battle itself, about commemoration. But it's also, I'm very impressed the way you have worked this into a project that your students are very involved in. So you didn't really tell people about that, but I, looked at your materials and I looked at the short films. She has a fantastic website that students have prepared these short films about different aspects of the battle, about Reconstruction, about commemoration, and they have maps and they have charts and they have a lot of text. And so they've really dug into this. And so, you deserve credit for organizing them, and your students deserve credit for, really getting into this project and doing the work that they've done. I have to commend you too for taking on, a public history project like this about Confederate monuments at a time when monuments are obviously something that everybody's very much thinking about and talking about. And here, in this case, I guess you could even say, in your case, it's not about eradicating a monument. It's about putting up a monument that should have been there all along. And so, the questions that it raises about, what the purpose of these monuments is and what they do for us, I think is all part of this project as well. And I guess the other thing I just wanted to say too, before I get to my questions, the other thing I wanted to say is, people like us who study the memory of the Civil War, we often talk in a very general, almost abstract way about how the memory of the lost cause became so powerful and even dominant throughout the South. We talk about like this very general way in which the lost cause memory had kind of political resources, financial resources to carry so much sway. And what your project does is it's so tangible. It's such a tangible demonstration of how the memory of the lost cause eradicates every other story that's out there about this battle, like tangibly, physically eradicates, so that, this image that you describe of the bodies of black and white Union soldiers that aren't even on the battlefield, that are off in, separated from it, so that their connection to the war is totally missing, is totally absent. So, it has all of these components, which is, some of the things that make it so interesting to me, and I think make it such an important project, and I'm really glad that you're taking it on. I gave you some idea of some of the questions that I'm interested in, so I guess I'll just start and ask some. One question that I had is, are you aware of any other battlefield sites that have a similar kind of story? Something where, I guess it would be this kind of eradication of the Union dead, or if not a total eradication, but something like anything similar, or does this one really strike you as distinct?
It has in common, there are several battles USCT troops were involved with, which are now state parks, and not under the National Park Service. And that tends to change the story. Fort Fisher, Fort Pillow, and Port Hudson, some of the major battles of Black troops. And then you have the unfortunate that Fort Wagner doesn't exist anymore. And you have like Milliken's Bend, which was a small battle, but very important to accepting Black slave soldiers. That too is what it was, so the Mississippi reclaimed. So you have that Black memory, other than the crater, which is part of the Richmond system, has been effectively wiped out. Part of it is because they're state parks. So yes, and I've heard the state park, Boyd Harris wrote a thesis on Specter of Savagery, which hasn't been published, Boyd, if you're listening, and talks about the state park problem. And that's what this is. It's the state park problem. Now that I've answered that, let me talk about my student involvement. I wanted it. One of the things is I did this, and then I realized I didn't have my story map up. I always give this with my story map, because the story map explains things. For example, like the memorial, you can see it. So we did a story map, and we have movies, and it's an excellent, outstanding job that explains everything. I'll have everyone so they can get it and have access to it. The interesting thing, why to get my students involved? Okay, so I'm sitting in front of you, you're my military history class, you're Florida students, you all went to Florida schools. Has anyone ever heard of Olustee? Crickets. No one has heard of Olustee. They have no idea it happened. And they're horrified once they hear the whole story. So that's why I did it. But also, to me, I always try to engage my students, because you have to. History is, I know this is going to be a shocker, you have to get the kids to have skills. Things like digital projects, which I have them do, and research, and writing short pieces for our website. I right now have my students researching the records to find out who might have been actually left there in the various regiments, particularly the 8th USCT, the 35th USCT, the 7th New Hampshire, and the 48th and 115th New York. They're researching who might be there by looking at their service records. I also want to make one other point. This is about, yes, Civil War memory. I'm a Civil War memory guy. I was in the Army. There's one value I've always held above all. Never leave a fallen comrade behind. When I look at that grave site, I almost fell to my knees, and I wanted to throw up, because they're there. Everyone acknowledge it like it's nothing. Like, oh yeah, well, the mass grave, yeah, it's probably over there. I don't even know what to say, how I respond to that. There's literally nothing. I kind of joked to someone, my last words might be Olustee. No, honestly, you have to see where it is and how they erase them. And I can do no other. But my students are doing a magnificent job, and they've been an inspiration. It's partly about jobs, but it's also partly about getting them to understand sacrifice.
Yeah. Okay, so can we go back to this question about, you were saying that there's a kind of failure to memorialize Black troops at other state parks specifically, that seems to be a kind of pattern. So, so I have a question along these lines too, that if there's a kind of, on some level too, the failure of the federal government to honor its own. I mean, maybe you can explain to me, like, state park, federal prerogatives vis-a-vis a state park, but where, at some point does the federal government have the right to come in and say, these are American soldiers who should be honored and should be respected regardless of the,
Well, that's interesting. Now, lately, I'll give them credit. I think people have been doing more.
Mm-hmm.
But for a very long time, a lot of the story is buried. For example, they won't say they weren't there, but they won't, but they're not an important part of the story. Like, if you go to Olustee, Black troops are there. Okay. But there has been some progress lately. I will admit that there's a lot of places that are basing that, like Natchez is trying to put up a monument. The more recently they were North Carolina has definitely stepped up. But here's the issue, and here's what's different. State park, okay, it's very hard, and this is a memorial landscape. And when people in 2015 tried to get a Union memorial, they treated it that way. They deserve a memorial, they were there. No one brought up the pesky point that they're still there. And so what I'm attacking this is, I can't control the state of Florida. I won't say anything. I can't control anything the state of Florida does. But if I have my story map, okay, imagine this is the Olustee battlefield, and this is Osceola National Forest. There's a fence, there's an African-American cemetery. Osceola Forest is controlled by the federal government all around. Mm-hmm. And I think federal law should, that these men, and we found the letter where the locals stopped them from removing the bodies. This was a very conscious effort to dishonor them. The federal government has an overarching authority over this area. And the federal government has the law to address this issue. They have the congressional intent that mandates that they do this. You're right, it would be good, and I think when it comes to states, you just have to pressure the states, and states have been getting better. There's been some of this movement, okay, we won't take down Lee's statue, we'll put up statues to African Americans, and there's been quite a number of memorializations lately. But this is a slightly different issue. It was not just that they put up a very ugly monument, and it really is, and that they controlled it. They made sure the Union dead were dishonored. And people are aware of it today and seem to allow it to continue. Mm-hmm. People who probably don't associate it with advocating the lost cause or the Confederate cause at all. Mm. But no, the states it's a very difficult issue because it's state land. Right. But this happens to be state land in the middle of that is controlled.
National forest.
Yes.
Right. Okay, I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but maybe people here have some questions too. But one thing I'm interested in, I have a set of questions, I guess, so I'll put them all together. Because one of the things you've talked about is how people there know. People there know there's a mass grave there. They know something about who's in that mass grave. So I'm kind of interested in the local oral histories or the local lore or sort of what's kind of, if there's a local Black community around Olustee, say, where people have talked for years about the presence of this mass grave. Or, I guess I'm thinking about other ways the story could be in the records somehow, I guess. I'm thinking also about, the veterans of this battlefield who go home and they say, what's being done for our comrades, white comrades, black comrades, who fell on this battlefield? Do they write letters? Do they petition the federal government to say, what's being done about this? Or, I'm thinking of another possibility, as you know, Grand Army of the Republic chapters who get together and they write their narratives about the battles that they participated in. And are there, GAR narratives where people wrote the story about the Battle of Olustee and maybe even documented some of the things that you're talking about?
The Grand Army of the Republic was very aware of Olustee. The Grand Army of the Republic was very aware of Olustee. And this is why I kind of think that. All right, so there was a policy the bodies were to be found and brought to national cemeteries. Congress appropriated, by our standards in those days, a lot of money, and to provide headstones to all veterans. This was very expensive. It was almost $1 million, I think. It was something, for our government at that time, it was a lot of money. So we found a letter from the Department of the South Quartermaster. And the quartermaster was complaining that the contractor, they had contractors whose job was to take the bodies and to move them from northern Florida, they went to the Beaufort National Cemetery.
And this would have been when?
1868.
Okay.
So he went through. So the quartermaster in this letter demanded, why are you saying that the locals wouldn't allow you to disinter the dead? And obviously the locals did not. Now, when I initially heard this story, everyone tried to tell me, oh, they were taken to Beaufort. I think everyone thought who were elsewhere and not in Florida or South Carolina, because this is New York regiments. They went home.
Right.
Assumed that what happened was what should have happened was when this man, he picked up bodies in Lake City and Tallahassee, Union bodies, and he got paid by the mile to transport them to Beaufort. It was a lot of money. That people said, well, they were there. They were supposed to be there. I think everyone thought they were moved like all the other bodies were. And Loomis Langdon was the only person, and when he tried to get the War Department to do anything, they basically sent him Grossman's report and said that there was an Olustee Soldiers Cemetery, which there wasn't. But I think everyone thought it was taken care of. Now, I have read Florida GAR records, Grand Army of the Republic records from my first book. They never mentioned Olustee at all. But here's the thing about Florida Unionists. There were many Florida Unionists who were from Florida, but most of the Floridians who came down to, most of the Florida GAR were people who came down to retire in Florida or to take advantage of timber or turpentine or whatever. They were basically people who came to Florida later. So they weren't very familiar. As to the oral history, I'd love to get at it. It's like we run into this brick wall. Even this newspaper reporter that was helping me, we were trying to talk to people about the African American cemetery. Now, people say, well, how do you think they know? Because the bodies are in a semicircle around the cross. And there are no headstones in this one area. Everyone says the bodies probably are. It's like they've avoided it. There's a semicircle, there's the cross, and behind it, there's just this empty space. I went to someone in Olustee the first time I went to follow up on this, and it was a person who was in charge of it. I said, well, I'm interested in the mass grave. He goes, oh, you mean the 18 by 12 mass grave? I went, yeah, I meant that one, actually.
As opposed to a different one?
As opposed to, maybe you have a lot of mass graves. But no, it was just, it's always like that there. They're always, everyone seems very aware. And,
well, you almost wonder if there were some local people who, because there was the report of their disinterment and that bodies were scattered and.
I think the locals knew all about it. The locals knew they were there. The locals, I think, probably destroyed the cross. Now, this is another thing that complicates things. Baker County has one industry, it's prisons. You're saying, well, what does that have to do with this? One of the people involved at Olustee said they think they buried African-American turpentine workers on top of the mass grave. So it might be hard to find them. But you see, here's the thing. They might have been convict labor, because that's what they did in Baker County. It was convict labor was provided to turpentine factories, which was kind of their number one industry.
There could be who knows? I don't want to speculate, but
I don't either, but there's nothing, I don't know either. I am going to dig into it more. I would like to, because we have to work with the African American community. I don't know if we'll be able to move the bodies or dig them up because it is in their sacred space. White people gave them this sacred space. And there you can see families that all rest together.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very important part. I mean, the irony is there are all these veterans of modern wars that are in things like it'll be a unit like the 93rd Division. So I know this is an African American. There'll be African American veterans and the space, as I always think of it.
Mm-hmm.
So something has to be done, but minimum, the federal government should have a memorial, they should have unknown headstones, they should do whatever they're supposed to do by law to mark these men's bodies, even if it's just on the other side of the fence. Because it really is like it's 30 feet to the fence. And then there's the state park land, which they actually told me, the state park person said, the federal government tells us everything we can do and not do. And I'm thinking, well, and I don't even know what to say. I think in a lot of ways, it has something to do with why I got into veterans work, because I was in the Army right after Vietnam, and we weren't a popular group. So I think one of the reasons I did get into it was I wanted modern veterans, particularly the young kids I teach, to come home and be welcomed. And I worked very hard at that. But it's very difficult to know people say, you sure they're there? I'm about 98% sure. And if they're not, everyone who I've ever talked to there is wrong. You can read in the archaeology report, where we think the mass grave is, we're going to do this test. It's just very casual, their understanding of this mass.
It's there, yeah. All right, well, maybe we should give other people a chance to ask some questions. Yeah.
My question is a little bit backward from where you are. And how did the 54th get there? I mean, I'm familiar with their training and Fort Wagner, of course, but frankly, probably like a lot of other people, I assumed after Fort Wagner, there wasn't much left of it. And how did they end up getting to Florida?
What happened was after Fort Wagner, they were rebuilt. They sent many replacements. Massachusetts was a kind of a smart state. A lot of states would just build a new regiment, but they really refilled their ranks with a new set of replacements. And then they were trained, and they were still part of the same brigade, Montgomery, who people don't very much. They were part of his brigade, and they were involved in the Charleston campaign. So they had been in active combat. Colonel Hollowell took over, who had been the second in command, and he rebuilt them and retrained them. And they were a very experienced unit. That would have made them a very experienced unit, highly motivated unit. They had good officers. They had lost a lot, but then by that time, a prestigious unit would get good officers to replace it. It's like everything. Whenever a unit's ground up in combat, I mean, this is my military historian side, they rebuild it with replacements and new officers, and they retrain, and they go out there again. And the 54th was sent with the other units of the Department of the South that had been assigned to Charleston. They had been in Jacksonville before, left, and this was their second invasion. They had been sent with other units. For example, they were very used to working the 7th New Hampshire, worked with them a lot. They were with them at Fort Wagner, the New York regiments I mentioned. All of these units were very familiar with each other. They had fought together in the past.
And I think that was true. The number of Massachusetts soldiers enlisted initially was relatively low compared to Ohio, New York, and Pennsylvania didn't really provide a lot of black soldiers, but after Wagner, that group of, I think it was 286 finally, that backfilled some of those losses. A lot of them, it was a much higher percentage of Massachusetts and Boston area soldiers that, truly saw the glory after Wagner, and they pitched in and started filling the ranks then. So there were a much higher percentage of Massachusetts.
Yeah, I mean, people sometimes are funny when it comes to black units. It's just a lot of times the 8th USCT did no worse than any green unit. I mean, that had never fired their rifles before. I mean, and the 54th was the experienced unit, and it executed a controlled retreat and protected everyone else. So they're not actually don't have as many deaths as other units because they didn't fall apart. They didn't break. And a Civil War unit that doesn't break with the technology of the time is much safer than one that does. But I mean, no one can blame the 7th New Hampshire. New Hampshire, a lot of their weapons failed. They walked right into it.
Is the railway that was there, of course, that's one of the great stories of the 54 soldiers that literally grabbed ropes and hauled that train that didn't have a locomotive, pull those wounded soldiers were loaded there. Is that railway still there?
Yeah, the railroad is here. African American Cemetery is here. It's sort of juts. It's right next to the railroad because that's where Loomis Langdon always supports his story. He was on the train when the guy pointed out to him where the memorial cross had been. And then beyond that is the battlefield itself. Or at least there might have been a battlefield in the area where the mass grave was, but what the official state park battlefield is right there. But yeah, the railway still runs next to it from Jacksonville.
So there's a somewhat related question from a person online. Linda says, there's another soldier missing, my great-great-uncle. Oops, there's a question away. My great-great-uncle served in 7th New Hampshire, was wounded, and with the magnificent help of the 54th Mass, which literally pulled a train carrying wounded, which malfunctioned all the way back to Jacksonville, a story I had never heard of until tracing my ancestor. He was taken to Beaufort, South Carolina, where he died a month later, buried the next day. But he is not in the National Cemetery in Beaufort, is not in New Hampshire, and cannot be found. Was there any other location which is known for Olustee burials?
What you describe is he may have been buried in a way that it wasn't marked well enough for after the war. After the war, like everyone, there would have been hasty burial sites. And what the Congress did was it authorized you to buy land near the battle, and it paid contractors to go all over the South to find every Union body they could anywhere and bring them. And I saw this guy was paid a lot of money. I was really impressed because he got it by mile. And so maybe his body wasn't found. But if he's anywhere, Beaufort is there's a Florence National Cemetery too. If he's not in the National Cemetery system, they may never have found him. Yeah, Peter.
You may know all about this, and there's certainly people here in the audience know about the history of 54th. But about, I want to say 30 years ago, there were bodies of 54th soldiers who had died outside of Charleston, that had died of disease during the siege, who were reburied in National Cemetery at that time.
Yes.
And it's a kind of, it seems so at odds with the story you're talking about in a way, in the sense that there was a real kind of effort from here and truly an effort from South Carolina to accomplish that, as I remember.
Well, yes, that's exactly what should happen. This is at an intersection of so many different issues. For example, many people are quite rightly concerned about the African American cemetery. One of the people involved told me what I had suspected was correct. The African American cemetery was allowed to grow around the mass grave. It wasn't there initially. It came afterwards, because I guess that land was considered good enough for them, or something. Now, so there is that. There is also this very strange, out of sight, out of mind. They haven't actually been dug up. People don't know if they can be dug up because of the fact that it's part of this larger cemetery. But there's also Florida. It's in 2014. It was a simple. The Sons of Union veterans wanted to put up a memorial to the Union dead. They managed to scuttle that, even without mention of the dead, which maybe would have given it more power. But all they wanted was a little piece of land to put the memorial. And they used the excuse that it was a black marble memorial and it would have been ugly and it wouldn't have fit the other memorials.
And who was it that said that?
The people, all of the Confederate heritage groups came out en masse and really went crazy in a public meeting. And they fiercely opposed it. And it died in committee or in the legislature. You know, the usual way they kill things politically. And so it never happened. But there was a proposal as recently as that. Now, none of the rhetoric at the time mentioned that. But it's outside of the area. It doesn't seem well known at all. And when I tell people, they look at me like, I always joke, they give me my look my dog gives me. They tilt their head at me. But everyone there seems very familiar with the story that they're still there.
Yeah, good.
Another group that's aware of it, right? There's still reenactments that
Yes.
take place.
Right.
Yes, they are.
Tell us a little bit more about that group.
Well, that group, what was interesting was in 1991, they were the people who, when I send you the story map, you'll see they were the people who replicated the cross that Lieutenant Grossman put up. And they did it, his report described it in detail. So they paid the money to have it put up, and it's still there. And some people there say, well, we already have a memorial there. And I said, that's not on the battlefield. That is in a private cemetery. And it doesn't mention the dead. So obviously, I think maybe the reenactors know about it. But every year, well, not during COVID, but recently, they haven't done the skirmish again. They do a skirmish. And they have 54th Massachusetts reenactors, and they have reenactors, white reenactors, and Confederate reenactors, and everyone kind of thinks this is a wonderful thing. And it is. I have nothing against reenacting. I just wish they'd reenact some of the more grisly parts. But okay, reenacting is if that's how you want to teach people history. I'm really not a snob that way. Like some people, you know as well as I do, some people, if that's what you want to do, you should. I think it's excellent. But I think, and they'll have like Frederick Douglass will be portrayed, and they'll talk about emancipation. And it's not a
He
lost
wasn't at Olustee, was he?
No, he wasn't. But they'll have someone.
Just want to make
they'll
sure.
have a living historian do him, which is good, and they'll talk about. People are aware of the 54th role, and they're aware of it. But the bodies are like, I don't know if death isn't the new obscenity, because no one mentions that. No one ever talks about the bodies very much. So yes.
And the Union reenactors were new to this, right? I think like had there been Confederates all along, and then
There had, but there's always Union reenactors, usually fewer.
Yeah, I did that in 1989 when I was stationed in Fort Benning. They ran a Connecticut out to Olustee Battle. It was 2 hours from Georgia there.
So you were there as a
I've
reenactor.
done.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, the 54th does, and they're welcome.
It was literally that. It was the weekend before it came out. So they had black soldiers. It's the first time I'd seen black soldiers in the Civil War
In a reenactment.
Yeah, so it's really kind of exciting. And they were the celebrities on the field that day. I'd say there were probably 300 or so reenactors. So
And was anybody talking about the dead? I mean, did that ever come up?
That's the thing. I'm trying to think about any. It's been some years ago, but I don't remember. This was '89, so it would have been before that cross. I think the movie coming out really probably
was a spur to a reenactment group. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it did. I mean, to give my friend Greg Irwin, he was a reenactor, and he was
and he was in the movie.
He was in the movie. He said one of the things they had to do was get black extras because there weren't black reenactors then. But now there are more. I know quite a few black reenactors, and it's been excellent that they do also a lot of living history, go to classrooms, and all this is good. And I'm glad for it. And I think we have made progress on getting the black story out. And here's the thing. I've always been a Civil War historian scholar. So I was like, monuments. Okay, yeah, it'd be nice, but it's up to communities to get rid of them. Or I say it's, no one's memory. I mean, we've written thousands of books. Monuments don't make anyone change their mind. But if you see this, the landscape was essential to the evolution of the erasure. Particularly my most important erasure, I think, is what people really miss, is the interracial nature of the Civil War. People say, well, let's give black people their due. They died and are buried with their 7th New Hampshire, New Yorkers. And it's funny, they're great regiments like the 48th, the 40s. The New York regiments, there's an upstate New York regiment, the 115th, there's immigrants, there's Germans. I mean, it's almost like the perfect Civil War mix. You have a regiment, the 35th is enslaved, the freemen of the 54th Massachusetts. 8th USC was largely free too. There were a lot of free men in that one. So it's like this, it's almost like, people talk about a melting pot. I think about it as a melting grave. It really is all of the people you suspect, the native born of the 7th New Hampshire. They're all there. And you wanted to erase as much, a lot of the lost cause erasure is erasing that it was important to convey that white soldiers did not fight for emancipation and never would and never sacrificed for it. That interracial coalition that did it is very important. Because one of the things I want to get across to people today is, the people of them time were racist. Many of those soldiers believed slavery was wrong, or they didn't think, even if they thought less of blacks, they didn't think they should be sold like cattle. So I think that's part of it. People accept there's the 54th, but they don't accept as much as, maybe they don't accept the guy in the movie who's probably the 7th Connecticut who goes, give them hell 54th. Mm-hmm. They don't accept that person because he could be in that grave, because if it's the 7th Connecticut, they're there too.
But what's interesting, Barb, is when you were talking about the history and you talked about the United Daughters of the Confederacy chapter and other people who sort of dismiss this, and they say, well, that was just a bunch of black soldiers. Like yes. In their mind,
they've racialized.
Yeah, they have totally racialized that whole group of soldiers and they've and in their own mind, I think, have also sort of segregated. And so said, okay, they have their own cemetery there, and that's why they're buried there. So you're right. Yes. I think that that mentality has kind of turned all of those soldiers into black soldiers.
Yes, they are. They've racialized the memory and excluded. They said if there were white soldiers involved, yes, there were white soldiers involved. The white soldiers were hammered. 7th New Hampshire went to Hendersonville. Oh my God, you just read their fates, and it's horrific. And the New York units, and with the foreign names, and the Italians and Germans and Irish. It wasn't a black battle, and it's not a black mass grave.
Right.
I want to thank you very much for our wonderful presentation, and thank everyone for joining us. It's 7 o'clock, it's just almost 7. Wrap it up. Thank you very much.